Hi everybody, Bobby Ogilvy, EQ coach and tech COO. Today's question: how does understanding the different types of happiness affect us growing our leadership skills or developing as leaders? Okay, so there was another video where we went over the four types of happiness, which are hedonic, prudential, eudaimonic, and chaironic. And anyway, you can see the descriptions here. Um, so if we think about how we develop as leaders, and obviously, one of the terms you're going to hear from me is emotional intelligence, EQ competencies. Um, how how could the different types of happiness we're leveraging affect us as leaders? Okay. Um, so let's try to maybe go through some of these in order to see what's possible. So you could see how, um, and there's lots of leadership styles, but there's not necessarily a lot of good ones, right? One of the probably the most research-based and kind of established for a long enough period of time effective leadership styles is transformational leadership, right? So there's a big sense of working through others, of trying to transform and develop people over time, which means long-term you're building capacity because you're using everyone's skills and you're trusting enough to develop a collegiality in terms of letting other people take on tasks, responsibility, and develop as opposed to trying to maintain control and authority, right? And there's lots of other things which lots of other leadership styles would definitely accent and complement that, right? So you could see how hedonic, with the not just experiencing joy, experiencing pleasure, but avoiding pain. You could see how that would be maybe a bit more key to more command and control types of leadership, or and command and control. I often think is kind of about punishing. I think the magic word is actually about control. If you think of approach and avoidance behaviors, you're trying to apply big punishers when someone does something that that authority leader, that kind of command and control leader doesn't like. And so what you end up doing over time is punishing all these unwanted behaviors and kind of then steering the people that you're leading, really, that you're influencing and kind of controlling, into a certain, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this, don't do this. Okay, here's your sandbox. And that's very restrictive. It's not very motivating. And there's really only very few situations which are, let's call it, time sensitive enough and behaviorally simplistic enough where that is the right, needed, and useful answer. Another short term one I would contrast this to is pace setting leadership. So, this is maybe more the positive end of hedonic happiness, but it's still relatively short term, right? So, when with pace setting, the leader is trying to be very high energy and productive, and that's trying to be kind of a role model to set that for others. So other people are high energy and productive, and that's okay as long as people know task wise what's in front of them, and you're working in maybe very short, brief stints. So, which is to say, working intensely. We know that after something like 30 hours per week, your marginal, per hour productivity starts to drop off. So this notion that your 30th hour, your 40th hour, your 50th, 60th, 70th hour of work per week are the same identical hours. No, that's BS. That's not actually how it works. So it becomes real diminishing returns if you just think you can just throw more manpower at things, or just try to create a norm where everyone works 60, 70 hour work week. That's just what we do, right? It's pretty unsustainable. Anyway, the point I was trying to make here was that, well, this command and control might focus a lot more on the applying punishers and the kind of avoiding pain end of things. Pace setting at its best, if it's rewarding people for doing that high pace setting work, it's probably using a lot more rewards. I suspect there are probably lots of departmental units with like uh, you know uh, sales units which would use pace setting, and then it just becomes around productivity and how much you can do. And when you're in that jammy end of things, you can get some good rewards, but it is a real rat race, right? It is rather short term, and you're there not because there's some deep meaning or you're even kind of using your skills. You're there because you're going after the next carrot and the next carrot and trying to see how long you can kind of keep this up. So those are very short term styles. Um, Prudential, I think, would lead to. Um, I was about to say kind of authentic leadership, but I think that's perhaps a bit too generous. Um, I think maybe a better way to frame this is if you think of adaptive leadership styles, where you're kind of balancing the four forces. Um, that in something like this, you would be maybe very key to the notion of something that you can, something you can do in the moment that it feels like you're doing something. You're filling the void. You're not doing nothing. So in that, it would be kind of anti laissez-faire, and it would want to um, perhaps feel like you've done the right thing retrospectively. But the reason I want to soften that is it's not really that there's a huge ethical or integrity regard. It's really that it's like we're trying to fill the void. So maybe this starts to get into pace setting as well. Um, it does lack a certain strategic depth. It certainly lacks the kind of talent depth. Um, Maybe this would be the kind of thing for people that want to see themselves as more operations managers than any kind of strategy leaders or kind of people leaders. So maybe this is where we want to use terms like management and not leadership, and say, most managers end up having a very prudential style, right? And when you think about it, most managers are like that because, to varying degrees, they're trying to kind of do the day-to-day things. They're trying to make sure things don't explode, and their job really isn't strategy. Their job is operations, right? So that probably most strongly fits with prudential leadership. Also, there tends to be this trend when you're dealing with medium and large organizations that they become this is kind of just an OD thing, organizational design thing, which naturally happens. As they get bigger, they become more process oriented, more bureaucratic, slower to change. And the way some people even frame it is almost like they start to drink their own Kool-Aid, where they can no longer even like see their gaps, right? So they become very myopic to what their problems are. Um, you could see how that being a problem of Prudential, and so you could see that kind of buying into the myth is, as long as I'm doing something, as long as I'm doing some activity, I'm doing what needs to happen, which, you know, short term, it may, I shouldn't say win the battle, it may survive the battle, but it will never win the war, right? Um, okay, so let's go on to the next two. Eudaimonic happiness, using people's strengths, bringing out virtue and excellence in people, intrinsic motivation. Yeah, this is the one probably most key to transformational leadership, which is, it's the jammy jam. It also, I think because this one also has probably the strongest focus on the real situation of handling things excellently and professionally or ethically. It's also the ones that would have the most regard for kind of the balancing that optimal tension of forces and adaptive leadership, or kind of a skillful way of handling strategy and what's going on around you, right? Um, Intrinsic motivation also strongly relate to authentic leadership, which is to say you're trying to do things for your own inner motives, why it makes sense in terms of your meaning and purpose, and really being very upfront and truthful about the situation, which also means never uh, deceiving or omitting the truth, and trying to be upfront about your own failings as, first and foremost, a method of trust building internal to the organization and externally. And then from that, I think that becomes a good premise for then big sustainable strategy, even though authentic leadership in and of itself isn't a strategy, but it becomes the kind of integrity premise, the kind of trust building and truthful premise, which then becomes an end to good strategy or sustainable strategy. Or you could also think of it as kind of a broad regard for stakeholders. Um, one one of the areas I really like about eudaimonic happiness is that it's really leaning into the existential void of meaning making and defining purpose, and that is true on an individual level, but that's also true on an organizational level, right? So organizations that are going through big change management initiatives and kind of not only externally can have a tone of what's our strategy, how are we going to differentiate ourselves, how do we need to change, or what are the drivers kind of pressuring us to change and become more competitive in some way, but the internal side of, like, are there parts of our values that need to shift. um, you could think of, if some of the big top tech firms, right? um, in the past, how long has it been, 5 years, sometime in the past 10 years, we had the new Microsoft CEO who's done some amazing things. Steve Jobs died, and we had a new Apple CEO. So they had to shift values in certain directions as part of an outer sense of strategically we're changing, and here's what we're doing. And internally, values wise, this is a shift on what we're kind of focusing on and feeling. Um, you could also think that going through kind of strategic change initiatives like this, beyond saying they're a good way to galvanize everything, they're also a good way to spot laggards and spot toxicity. right? So just like anything, you're going to have a bell curve, a certain distribution of people, and so then if we're dealing with kind of motivation, and you could say change management, but let's just say engagement and motivation for a second, right? You're going to have champions way at the far end who not only super engage themselves but positive influence on other people, and they can champion that. You have a lot of people in the middle, varying degrees of individual engagement, and one moment, kitty cat, I am recording a video. Yes, please shut up. My apologies. My roommate has a couple kitty cats. And now I've lost my own flow. Okay, we were talking about the bell curve, and then on the far end of that bell curve, you have rather toxic people, which say individually they're not that engaged, but they can become very toxic to others. So it can become maybe a good time to root some of those people out. Which is to say, the transformational leader says, "Listen, what can I do to fix, transform, bring out the best in this person?" And if the answer is you can't do anything, and they're making a bunch of other people, a bunch of our organization and our context worse, it might be a good time to get rid of them, right? Okay, so, and what kind of leadership styles would be key to the last type of happiness, Chaironic happiness? Servant leadership. Servant leadership has a big sense of not just helping others, but there are purposes kind of bigger than ourselves. A lot of religious organizations have a notion of servant leadership. And on an individual level, I would say servant leadership is particularly potent when it comes to the individual transformation, because so you may have kind of seen this before, but the way I kind of now frame my purpose is that I use EQ coaching and psychometrics as part of transforming lone wolf leaders into pack protectors, and I do that by boosting their empathy, their vitality, their grit or their willpower, and their noble purpose, which has all these great impacts, but then also ends up boosting team agility. And so this notion that there is this leadership arc where you have to go from being the individual star performer, this kind of lone wolf performer, whether it's sales or engineering or whatever, analyst, whatever background you come from, to this kind of getting better success out of others. That is not just a big attitudinal shift, but it's a big kind of technical shift, and it requires using a lot more EQ skills, less of just your own technical skills and IQ and kind of knowledge training. And then that becomes even more so true at the high end levels when you really need to contemplate strategy and what's possible. And that's, I think, so some of the kind of high level strategy design stuff you may have heard, like working from first principles, sometimes from an internal, inside out way. One thing you may have heard now is like zero based budgeting. The idea being that, from year to year, it's not even you're looking at changes year to year in terms of budgets. You're trying to almost like bake your budget from scratch and kind of like each time redesign your organization. Now, obviously, pragmatically, it's not actually going to be delete everything, but it does get you to question a lot of assumptions in your organization and say, what do we really need going forward, right? What else is good about, so back to the point about individual development. One of, I think, the key things about Chaironic happiness is that it really becomes a personal kind of keeping yourself in check metric. Or if you look at those character strengths, you guys all know that I'm a big fan of the VIA character strengths assessment, and that has 24 character strengths, and there's 6 categories, and yeah, and so that one does contain virtues around prudence and self-regulation, and moderation and things like that, and those are there for good reason, right? Because you want to be able to gain perspective and check yourself and connect with others, and make sure that for all of your good eudaimonic strengths, that's not making you kind of blind or brutish, or even just in more subtle ways, just a bit single-minded, a bit myopic to what's going on. This might be a good point to bring up. There's this Buddhist notion of passion, aggression, and ignorance, and I think they call it 3 poisons. But the idea is that under the lens of kind of I like this, I don't like that, we are drawn towards our passions, which are things we like, and I like this thing and keep it towards me, and give me pleasure from that, and aggression, things you hate, things you want to push away. I'm thinking of a few particular people in my life which I just regard at this point as kind of very disordered and ill-willed and kind of subversive, and so I'll keep those evil leaders away. And then that means the third category of things that don't fit into those first two buckets, you're just ignorant, you're just totally blind to, right? And so it does create a certain, in those, let's call it strong mental models, those strong cognitive schemas, it can create a certain blindness. So might also be a good point to touch into MBTI, Myers-Briggs personality types. So if you think of people that are NI types, am I getting this right? NT types? I'm getting the type terms, the subtype terms a little bit mixed up. Basically, people that basically mix intuition and thinking can have strong issues with this because they're used to thinking intuitive mental models, mental schemas, whether they realize it or not. And they're also used to either thinking and judging through things, or I think also if it was an intuition and introversion can have the same thing, because you're used to thinking mental models, and the introversion part means that it's often a very internal experience. It's not it's not easy to share as a process, right? And you can see how that often means it can become hard to objectively spot or get a little bit of perspective on your own methods and process, and it could mean you become kind of a slave to your own idiosyncrasies, mentally and behaviorally, emotionally, right? Anyway, so Chironic is good at spotting that and getting rid of it. So of course, on really a small scale, you could say it relates to mindfulness and how much concentration and attention and awareness you can cultivate. But ultimately, this means self-transcendence, which becomes this really important kind of touchstone for ongoing personal growth and getting a sense of what possibilities are out there. All right, so I think I've drawn on a bit too long about how these different types of happiness can make us better leaders, but hopefully you take some of these to heart. I would get you to think about your own leadership style here and what you want to embody. And so obviously from a eudaimonic standpoint, I would say, what are you doing well? What are existing strengths in terms of how you're approaching working with others and bringing out their best, or however you see that? And are there an area or two which you could stand to work more on? Let me also muse on kind of the research component of this for a bit. There's still more research that's needed on all of these, particularly, and that all of these should be operationalizable and measurable. And so then, as much as I've said in the past video, Eudaimonic and Chironic are the best, Tadonic and Potential less so. These all still have their place, and I suspect what we will see as we dig more into this is ratios of uh, a certain amount of the different types of happiness, which is to say you probably want some hedonic happiness in your life. You don't want zero hedonic happiness, right? That would be a very austere and probably painful life. But you don't just want to all be prudential or all be hedonic. It could be that you need to activate kind of all of these at once. I also like to think of these as different time frames. Some are more in the moment, some are more kind of future or past facing. So maybe we'll have a better way of approaching these, which can kind of optimize all of them as we dig more into the literature of this. But think about how you could bring out the best in all of these in your own life, in your own leadership context that you're grappling with. So again, I'm Bobby Olvey, EQ coach and tech COO, and hopefully you're all developing your leadership skills, and we'll talk to you all soon.